Good evening, respected senior faculty members and my dear colleagues. At the outset, I have an apology to make because actually I was asked to make this presentation maybe 3 or 4 weeks back, but because of some unforeseen circumstances related to COVID, I had to postpone this presentation. So my apologies to Patta Radhakrishnan sir for being too late. So what I have been trying to do in this presentation is to talk about colonic cancer. So now this is the global picture of colon cancer. The blue picture shows the incidence pattern and the red or the orange picture shows the mortality pattern. So if you look at our own country, you can see that luckily we are in the low incidence areas as well as low mortality areas. So this is a fact regarding colon cancer across the globe. So what I'll be trying to do in today's presentation is to talk about colon cancer in a practical perspective. And I have been told that majority of the viewers or listeners are surgical postgraduates or DNB surgery or MCH gastro and MCH in surgical oncology. So I'll keep the presentation somewhere in between that those levels so that they can benefit theoretically as well as practically for the upcoming exams as well. Am I clear and audible, sir?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
So before going into the treatment aspects, it's always better to look into the anatomy of colon. Recently, when I made a presentation on rectal cancer also, I spoke something about colonic cancer. Generally, we have a tendency to speak about colorectal cancers clubbed together. But as a surgeon, as an anatomist, or as an oncologist, we know that both these two organs are different entities. If you look at colonic cancer, colon as an anatomical organ, you find that majority of the part of colon is intraperitoneal, except for the posterior aspect of the ascending colon and the posterior aspect of the descending colon. So basically, it's more of an intraperitoneal organ than an extraperitoneal organ. The second peculiarity of colon is that it's a combination of midgut and hindgut, and it is one of the most surgeon-friendly intra-abdominal organs, not like your esophagus or not like your rectum or not like your pancreas. It's more surgeon-friendly because it's more amenable to surgical resections. The post-operative complications are not as much as you would see in a gastrectomy or a hepatobiliary resection or a rectal cancer surgery. So it's a more surgeon-friendly organ. So as I said, you have to understand the basic fact that colon is different from rectum in spite of the fact that we have a tendency to club these together, because the natural history of colonic cancer is different from the natural history of rectal cancer. The natural history of colonic cancer is such that most of the time the metastases are systemic in nature. Local recurrence is very rare, and most of the systemic metastases are in the lung and the liver. But if you look at the natural history of rectal cancer, it is more of a local disease because it's extraperitoneal. And I'm not saying that systemic metastases are not there, but you are equally concerned about local recurrence as well as systemic metastasis in rectal cancer. But in colonic cancer, you're not too much worried about local recurrence. You're worried about systemic metastasis once your surgical part is over. That difference between colonic cancer natural history and rectal cancer natural history, you should be understanding to start off with. And again, as I said, surgical principles are same as in rectal cancer. You need to have a good margin. You need to have a good nodal clearance. But what is different between colon and rectum is that adjuvant therapies are different. The same thing I had highlighted when I spoke about rectal cancer. But in case there are new viewers or different viewers, or I want to reiterate the fact once again, adjuvant therapy in colon cancer is basically systemic therapy. And the basic form of systemic therapy is chemotherapy. So once you do a surgery for colon cancer, you give the patient systemic therapy in the form of chemotherapy. But when it comes to rectal cancer, as I said earlier, local recurrence is a major problem. So you have to add on radiotherapy to your surgery, and chemotherapy also plays a part in rectal cancer. So in colon cancer, after surgery, all the patients or majority of the patients who need a systemic therapy receive chemotherapy. But in rectal cancer, it is radiotherapy that is given along with surgery. And one important point I would like to highlight, which again I highlighted when I presented rectal cancer, is that you should be very careful when you're operating a sigmoid colonic cancer, because most of sigmoid colonic cancer you operate primarily and then send to the radiation oncologist or a medical oncologist or an oncology center for adjuvant therapy. But you should very specifically mention in an operation note that the lesion is above the peritoneal reflection. That is very important thing, because this operative documentation is very important for the oncologist to decide on the adjuvant therapy. If you note in your operation notes that it is above the peritoneal reflection or it is sigmoid lesion, they would give adjuvant chemotherapy. But if the lesion is at the peritoneal reflection or below the peritoneal reflection, it would be radiotherapy. So the inputs or the feedback that you give to the medical oncologist or radiation oncologist is very important for them to decide on the adjuvant therapy, because in sigmoid colon, it is chemotherapy, but in the upper rectum and the lower rectum, it is radiotherapy. So this important data should be transferred to the medical oncologist or radiation oncologist, whoever is going to treat the patient after the surgery. So this is the basic difference between colon and rectum. Now, if you look at the anatomy in a bit more detailed manner, you can understand that, as I said earlier, there's a combination of midgut and hindgut in colonic cancer. So you need to receive blood supply both from the superior mesenteric artery and the inferior mesenteric artery. So the right side is supplied by the superior mesenteric artery and the left side is supplied by the inferior mesenteric artery. But the most important thing is that there is intercommunication between the superior mesenteric artery and inferior mesenteric artery in the form of mesenteric vascular arcades. And the most common mesenteric vascular arcade is the one close to the colonic wall, which is known as the marginal artery of Drummond. This is invariably present in most of the patients. In addition to the marginal artery of Drummond, which is very close to the bowel wall, you have an arc of Riolan and the meandering artery of Moskowitz. So these are the three mesenteric vascular arcades which communicate between the superior mesenteric artery system and the inferior mesenteric arterial system. This is very important when you're operating on the left side, because the presence or absence of any of these can have a huge impact on the vascularity of the curtains. So you should be very careful when you do the anastomosis. You should check for the presence or the pulsation of any of these vascular arcades before you finish off the anastomosis. It's very important when you're doing the left-sided anastomosis. Now, when it comes to nodal stations, again, it's very important to note that whenever it comes to nodal dissection or nodal anatomy, it is a Japanese way of doing it. Very, very impressive, because this picture has been taken from the Japanese guidelines. And if you look at it, the nodal stations of colon has been divided into different tiers. If you look at it, there are red nodes which are very close to the colonic wall, which are known as the pericolic nodes. You can call this the tier 1 nodes or level 1 nodes or the first line of nodal stations. Beyond that, what you can see is the blue nodes. Blue nodes are along the named vessels, right? Right colic, ileocolic, middle colic, or the sigmoid branches. So this forms the second tier of lymph nodes or the level 2 lymph nodes. And beyond that, you can see what is the yellow lymph nodes. And if you look at very carefully, you can see that these yellow lymph nodes are along the superior mesenteric artery on the right side and on the inferior mesenteric artery on the left side. These are known as the level 3 lymph nodes or the tier 3 lymph nodes. So the lymph node stations in colon are divided into tier 1 or level 1, which is the pericolic lymph nodes, or the blue lymph nodes, which is known as the principal lymph nodes, or the yellow lymph nodes, which is known as central lymph nodes. Beyond that, there's something known as a paracentral lymph nodes, actually the para-aortic lymph nodes. But from the surgical point of view or resection point of view, what is important is the red, blue, and the yellow nodes, which form what is known as the D1 dissection, D2 dissection, and the D3 dissection, which we will be discussing later on in our presentation. So this anatomical picture should be very clear in our minds when you go ahead with the surgery of colonic cancers. Now, again, regarding risk factors, I don't want to spend much time on this. This is there in any textbook. The fact is that there are hereditary factors, and then there are modifiable risk factors, which are good risk factors as well as bad risk factors. Some of these factors can be definitely modified, but by modifying this, you can reduce the risk of having colonic cancer. I don't want to dwell into the risk factors, etc. I'll move on to the next slide. When it comes to symptoms of colonic cancer, again, there's a big difference between right-sided colonic cancer and the left-sided colonic cancer. When I say right-sided colonic cancer, I mean lesions arising from the ascending, the hepatic, and part of the transverse colon. When I say left-sided colonic cancer, descending colon and sigmoid. And again, you all know that the right side, the lumen is larger than the left side, right? And moreover, the contents of the lumen, inside the lumen, are more semi-solid or liquidy in nature on the right side. So the point is that when the patient develops symptoms, most of symptoms are non-specific, or blood loss is the major symptom in right-sided colonic cancer. And many times the patient presents with symptoms of anemia in the form of generalized weakness, fatigue, or anemia by itself. And rarely they present as a mass. But when it comes to left side, you know that the lumen is narrower, and moreover, the contents are more solid. As a result of this, the contents do not go down as easily on the right side, and majority of the time patient present with altered bowel habits in the form of obstruction or difficulty in passing stools or lessened frequency of stools, etc. So that basic difference between right-sided and left-sided colonic cancer are not there, not only in the arterial anatomy, not in the nodal anatomy, in the presentation of symptoms as well. So right-sided cancer is present with anemia and non-specific symptoms, whereas left-sided colonic cancer present with altered bowel habits or more of obstructive symptoms. That is why they present much earlier than the right-sided. Since the patient has got an obstruction, he will immediately seek medical attention. So left-sided colonic cancers present much earlier than right-sided colonic cancer. Now again, once the patient has got symptoms suggestive of a colonic cancer, I'll just directly go into investigations. The basic investigation that you should be doing mandatorily in all patients is a CEA and a full colonoscopy. Why do you want to do a full colonoscopy? Because as I said earlier, when I presented rectal cancer, there is incidence of 30% of synchronous lesions. Synchronous lesions may be in the form of polyps, adenomas, etc. But synchronous cancers are seen in 3% of the patients. But let me tell you, this is data from the West. So 30% of the patients may have synchronous lesions and 3% of the patients may have synchronous cancers. But if the patient is obstructed and by some means you're not able to do a full colonoscopy, you should do a full colonoscopy within 6 months of the surgery, especially in patients who are less than 50 years of age, because their family history background may suggest a presence or absence of synchronous lesions in the non-operated part. So if you're able to do a full colonoscopy, do it upfront. But if the patient is obstructed, you have to complete the colonoscopy within 6 months of the surgery to pick up any other lesions that may have been missed previously. Again, once you've done a CE and colonoscopy and a biopsy, the next investigation for moving forward as far as the management is concerned, do a CT scan of the chest and abdomen, both for staging and for localizing the T and N status. Again, you're looking for lesions of the lung and the liver when you take a CT of the chest and abdomen, because these are the two organs where there's a high chance of metastasis for colonic cancer, liver and lung. Again, if you ask me, is there a role for PET scan? No, there is no role for PET scan in initial evaluation of patient. Again, the commonly asked question is, why do you want to do a CEA pre-operatively? Again, this is very important because it has got a prognostic, diagnostic value, but it has got an important prognostic value. For example, if a patient has got a normal pre-operative CEA value, he has a good outcome post-operative. And if the patient had an elevated CEA and it normalizes after the post-operative period, that patient also has got a good outcome. But if the patient had an elevated CEA and it remains to be elevated in the post-operative period as well, the probability of survival is much lesser. So if you have a patient with an elevated CEA in the pre-operative period, you should look at the post-operative CEA. And if the post-operative CEA has come down significantly, you can presume that this patient has a good prognosis when compared to a patient whose CEA has not come down. So you naturally expect the CEA to come down even after your surgery, and this would denote a good prognostic class of patients. So you have to do a CE upfront itself, even though it doesn't have a diagnostic potential. Now, again, as I said, a CT scan of the chest has to be done in most of the patients. But if you ask me critically, should all patients need a CT scan of the chest for metastasis? Because the ESMO guidelines, if you look at it, they say that the clinical benefit of routine CT chest scan is controversial and its use is not generally recommended. So what is the problem? So all patients do not need a CT of chest. But most of the institute, as even my center, we do a CT scan of the chest in almost all the patients. But if you are asked, should you do it in every other patient? ESMO guidelines say it need not be done because the chance of picking up a lesion in early colonic cancer is very rare. So if a patient is presenting with a palpable lump, if the patient has got a T3, T4 or a node positive lesion on the CT abdomen, or if the patient has got symptoms suggestive of metastasis, or the upfront CE is very high, then there is definitely a role for doing a CT chest of all the patients. But otherwise, if the patient has got an early lesion on the CT scan of the abdomen, if the patient doesn't have any symptoms, the CE is within normal limits, an X-ray of the chest would suffice. So that is a controversy regarding CT scan for all the patients as part of metastatic evaluation. Now, as I said earlier, is there a role for PET scan all the patients? Again, as I said, there is no role for routine PET scan as initial modality of investigation all the patients. But if the CT abdomen or CT chest that you have taken shows some finding which is suspicious or equivocal, and that lesion you want to further characterize, in such a patient, there is a role for PET CT scan. The second indication for doing a PET scan in a patient with colonic cancer is during the follow-up. If you find that after curative treatment, there is a rise in CE, then you would go ahead with a PET scan. So these are the only two indications for doing a PET scan. One is if there is a suspicious finding on the CT chest or abdomen, to further characterize, you may take a PET scan. And in a patient who is on follow-up, if the CE is rising, then also you would take a PET scan. So these are the only two indications for doing a PET scan in the case of carcinoma of the colon. Now, again, another issue that is commonly discussed among postgraduate at the postgraduate level is, does blood transfusion have an effect on the prognosis of colon cancer? Let me tell you, this was a randomized controlled trial published in 1993 in the famous New England Journal of Medicine, which found that among patients who received blood transfusion when compared to patients who did not receive blood transfusion, there's a significant increase in the output, the significant deleterious effect of blood transfusion. Among allogenic and autologous blood transfusion, they're not much of a difference. But if you look at patients who did not receive a transfusion, they have a better outcome. So this was a study which is the reason behind all of us being taught that blood transfusion has got a poor prognostic value as far as colonic cancer is concerned. But this was a study which was done in 1993. But subsequent to this, over the last 2 decades, there have been no randomized controlled trials, but there are multiple number of studies or multiple reviews that have shown that blood transfusion by itself doesn't have a poor prognostic implication on carcinoma of the colon. It means that in cases where you're doing blood transfusion, the disease may be more advanced, or disease may be infiltrating other organs, or the general condition of the patient may be poor. Otherwise, blood transfusion as such doesn't have a poor prognostic impact on colonic cancer. But this was one trial which showed that there is an impact on outcomes. Now, again, going to the broad treatment principles of colonic cancer, if I were to put every other aspect of treatment of colonic cancer in one single slide, I would say that stage 1, which are T1, T2 node negative, surgery forms the primary modality. Stage 2, low risk, high risk, whatever stage it is, irrespective of stage 1, 2, and 3, except for stage 4. All these patients would have surgery as their primary modality of treatment. There is no doubt about it. The only problem is regarding the adjuvant therapy. Stage 1, there is no role for adjuvant therapy. Stage 2 can again be divided into low risk and high risk. If it is stage 2 low risk patient, there is no role for adjuvant therapy. Stage 2, if it happens to be high risk, based on the factors that I mentioned over here, then there is a role of chemotherapy, but I put a yellow, a green and red over here because this is a controversial area, which again I will discuss in my subsequent slides. But stage 3, there is node positive patients. There is no doubt all the patients should receive adjuvant chemotherapy. How do you differentiate a patient with stage 2 into low risk and high risk? It is based upon the number of lymph nodes that have been harvested, differentiation, vascular and lymphatic or perineural invasion, obstruction, and PT4 stage. So if any of these factors are there in a stage 2 patient, you would put the patient at a high risk and then give him the option of getting chemotherapy or not. But I would like all the surgeons listening to this to very carefully look at this particular risk factors. Most of these are non-modifiable except for the lymph node sampling. This directly reflects upon the quality of surgery. If you're a good surgeon and if you've done a good surgery and you've taken more than 12 lymph nodes, the patient belongs to a low risk. But if you've done a poor surgery or the lymphatic sampling or lymphatic dissection has not been adequate and you get less than 12 nodes, automatically the patient goes into high risk. Not only that goes into high risk, he would need chemotherapy. So the one single factor which can be modified and modified by the surgeon is the lymph node retrieval. That is the importance of the quality of surgery in colonic cancer. Now again, moving a bit deeper into what are the surgical principles of colonic cancer. Again, as I said, anywhere in oncology, look at it, there are 2 things. One is adequate margins and adequate nodal clearance. If you can attain both this, it's an adequate surgery. So what is adequate margin? What is adequate nodal clearance as far as colonic cancer is concerned? That's what we will be looking at. Again, if I were to keep it very simple, on the right side, you have 3 surgeries. For a lesion situated in the cecum or the ascending colon, you would do what is known as the right hemicolectomy. In the right hemicolectomy, you will sacrifice the ileocolic artery, the right colic artery, and the right branch of the middle colic artery, and then do a iliotransverse anastomosis. For example, but if the lesion is in the hepatic flexure or in the proximal part of the transverse colon, you would do what is known as the extended right hemicolectomy. In extended right hemicolectomy, again, you would take out the ileocolic artery, the right colic artery, and you take out the middle colic artery, both the right and the left branches of the middle colic artery, and you do a iliotransverse anastomosis. So that is the difference between a right hemicolectomy and extended right hemicolectomy. For a transverse colonic lesion, you can confine yourself by doing a transverse colectomy as well and a colocolic anastomosis where you take out only the middle colic artery. These are 3 defined surgeries for a right-sided colonic cancer. But when it comes to left-sided colonic cancer, you have 2 surgeries. One is the left hemicolectomy, where you take out the left branch of the middle colic artery and the left colic artery. And you have what is known as sigmoid colectomy, where you take out the sigmoid branches, preserving the superior rectal artery. So here you do colopolyc anastomosis. Here also you do a colopolyc anastomosis by Hand-Swan technique or a Stapler's technique. So these are the standard terminologies that we have been using for time immemorial for defining the various surgeries in colonic cancer. But if you want to take it a bit more deeper or a bit more into practical or what is evolving, we can understand that if you look at the literature coming out or the practices that have been changing over last 2 or 3 decades, we have been trying to redefine margins in colonic cancer. Sorry for that. We have been trying to redefine the margins in colonic resections. This is where I would like to bring in 3 new terminologies. One is known as a complete mesocolic excision, CME. The second terminology is CVL, which is otherwise known as central vascular ligation. And the third terminology that I would like to discuss a bit is a D3 dissection. So these are the 3 terminologies which have been in colonic cancer over the last 1 decade or 1.5 decades. Now, let me take you back to an article published in 2008 from the Erlanger series, a German center where Hohenberg works. What they did was they simply compared the surgeries done between 2 eras, 1978 to 1984, and surgeries done between 1995 to 2002. What happened in between this was that they standardized the colonic surgery. If you would remember, this was the same time when the standardization of the rectal cancer surgery in the form of TME was taking place. So when people started to standardize the TME surgery, some others started to standardize the colonic surgery as well. And when they compared the outcomes, they found that local recurrence, which was 6.5% the older era, came down to 3.5% after standardization of surgery. This is without any chemotherapy, without any adjuvant therapy. Just by standardizing the surgery itself, they were able to bring down the recurrence to 3.6%. And not only that, the survival increased from 82% to 89%. It's a significant improvement. So they found out that they have to standardize the surgery in a more radical way than a more anatomical way. So what is the anatomical changes that they did? And this is something which I would like all the viewers to focus a bit. As I said earlier, a part of the ascending colon and a part of the descending colon is not covered by peritoneum. So if you look at this particular anatomical aspect, you can see that this is the peritoneal reflection, comes over here, winds around the colonic wall, and then just reflects into the abdominal wall. And behind that, there is no facial layer, but there is no mesentery. What happens is that it is closely abutting the retroperitoneal tissues. But there is a condensation of a facial layer known as the Todd's fascia over here. So this is the area where you have to focus while doing the surgery in terms of complete mesocolic excision. Earlier, what we used to do was lift up the colon along with the mesentery along this plane. But when you go along this plane, there's all chances that the mesocolon may be incomplete or your retroperitoneal margins may turn out to be positive. So in a modified form of complete mesocolic excision, what you should do is you should take out the Todd's fascia also along with the facial condensation, and this plane of dissection should be continued till you reach the root of the mesentery. So this is the anatomical concept of complete mesocolic excision. This which will take you onto a holy plane, a vascular plane, and will also take you to the D3 nodal stations. This was the modification being suggested by this group of people. And this was tried out in many other centers as well. And I hope you would remember who Philip Quirk is. Philip Quirk is a person who has been closely working along with Bill Heald in standardizing rectal cancer surgery. And he has been the person behind what is known as the extra levator APR. What he did was he compared the surgeries in his center versus the surgery in Hohenberg center. What did they find? They found that in the Erlanger series or in the Hohenberg series, 90% of the patients were undergoing surgery in the mesocolic plane. Whereas in Leeds, only about 30 to 40% of the patients were undergoing surgery in the mesocolic plane. Or the plane was inadequate in a large number of patients in Leeds when compared to patients undergoing surgery in Erlanger. What does this mean? You have to take out the vessels till their root. Not only that, even the mesocolon also should be taken out in intact fashion. You cannot cut into the mesocolon. You have to take out the ileum, ascending colon, and the other part of the body doing a right hemicolectomy. Not only that you ligate the vessels high up over here, the mesocolon also should be excised completely. That is the concept of complete mesocolic excision. And the point is, does it improve the outcomes? Yes. Again, Philip Cute did a retrospective analysis of his own patients and found out that in spite of all these patients having an R0 section, if you can do the surgery in the mesocolic plane, the survival is significantly improved. This is a retrospective analysis, but even this retrospective analysis showed that a mesocolic plane of surgery in colon cancer can impact on the outcome statistically significantly, and it improves survival compared to intramesocolic plane or muscularis propria plane. So this was the outcomes of this particular study. And again, this has been over the last 10 or 15 years, this particular aspect have been extensively studied. Again, this is a large study from the Danish colorectal cancer group. Again, they compared surgeries between two different centers. One center was doing the conventional surgery and the other center was doing surgery in the mesocolic plane. Again, showed that not only in terms of recurrence, in terms of overall survival also, a complete mesocolic excision, the surgical plane that I just now described, improves the outcome in terms of recurrence, reducing the recurrence and improving the survival. And again, based on these observations, there has been a new terminology that has come up in terms of right hemicolectomy, left and sigmoid. It's no more right hemicolectomy, it is right mesocolectomy. It is not left hemicolectomy, it's left mesocolectomy. And again, it's not only the colon that you're removing the mesocolon also. This is the new terminology proposed in the article published in Surgery in 2010. I don't know whether it has been approved by all, but the point is that colonic surgical anatomy or the planes of colonic surgery also has to be redefined in the same way you redefine the anatomy or surgical techniques in the rectal cancer. By doing so, you have definitely improved not only the surgical planes, you can improve the outcomes in terms of reducing the recurrence and improving the survival as well. You may think that this is a new terminology or new concept. If you look at this particular picture, you can very well understand that this picture is from an old textbook. In that particular textbook, it is very clearly mentioned that there is something known as the lymphatic area. To remove the lymphatic area, it will be necessary to tie the middle colic artery close to the origin. That's what is high ligation is. And to remove the mesocolon from this point to the bubble. So they say that you have to ligate the vessel high up and remove the entire mesocolon also. When was this article published? This article was published in 1907 in the Lancet by Jemison and Dobson. So the concept was there from 1907 itself, but somehow it got missed, or we didn't give much of an importance to this. We started to realize this only late in the 2008 or 2010. And today the fact is that you have to go in the correct plane. The entire mesocolon has to be removed, and you have to have an intact mesocolic fascia, not only high ligation, to improve your nodal yield, to improve your margin negativity rate. So this is what is one of the holy embryological plane that we're talking about. That's a complete mesocolic excision. Now, second terminology that I would like to familiarize you with is central vascular ligation and D3 dissection. Again, there is a lot of confusion in whether these two are the same or these are two different entities. Okay, sorry, somebody is listening. No problem. So now let me discuss central vascular ligation. Before going to central vascular ligation, let me again show you the picture of the anatomy. This is the same picture which I showed initially. You have the lymph nodes along the colonic wall, lymph nodes along the main artery, and lymph nodes on the superior mesenteric artery on the right side. When it comes to left side, you have lymph nodes along the colonic wall, lymph nodes along the main artery, lymph nodes at the root of the artery, and there are other lymph nodes on the aorta. So this is the lymphatic spread of colonic cancer on the right side and the left side. Now what is D1, D2, and D3? All these lymph nodes, as I said earlier, can be classified into D1 nodes, which are very close to the colonic wall, D2, which are along the main lymphatics, and D3, which are at the root. So these are the red nodes, blue nodes, and yellow nodes. So what is D3 dissection? D3 dissection is nothing but taking out the nodes till their root. So conventionally, what we used to do was ligate the trunk of the vessel over here. But D3 dissection involves removal of the nodes on the surface of the superior mesenteric vein and superior mesenteric artery as well. So in addition to doing a high ligation of the vessels, you have to go 1 or 2 centimeters onto the artery and vein and take out the nodes in this green described area. This is what is D3 dissection. So this is the specimen in which a D3 dissection has been done. You can see that this is the second and the third part of duodenum, the superior mesenteric vein, superior mesenteric artery. So you should not confine yourself to the lateral border of the superior mesenteric vein. You should go on to the surface of superior mesenteric vein, superior mesenteric artery, and this area forms what is known as the D3 station. And if you can see, this is the lower border of pancreas, and this is the plane that you develop for a Whipple's resection. So this area should be cleared, and all these nodes should be taken to quantify it as a D3 dissection. And again, what does the Japanese do? For example, for each site, you can see that, for example, if a tumor is located over here, this is what is known as a D1 dissection, where you remove only the pericholic lymph nodes. D2 dissection, you go up to the root of the vessel. But in a D3 dissection, you not only go up to the root of the vessel, you take out the nodes on the main trunk. That is the superior mesenteric artery and vein on the right side. When it comes to middle colic artery area, same thing. You go up to the root of the superior mesenteric artery vein and take out the nodes on the surface of superior mesenteric artery and vein. You not only do high ligation, you take out these nodes also. On the left side, same picture, inferior mesenteric artery nodes are also taken out. But the confusion is central vascular ligation same as Japanese D3? I put in such a way that Japanese D3 and central vascular ligation is a bit different, because in one terms, Japanese are more aggressive, because D3 dissection, you actually remove the nodes on the surface of the artery also. But central vascular ligation goes only up to the central vessels. So in that terms, the Japanese are a bit more aggressive. And I would say Japanese are a bit conservative also, because they don't take out as much length of the colon as you would do in a right hemicolectomy or left hemicolectomy. I'll show you. This is because of the fact that the Japanese have done extensive studies on the extent of lymph node involvement and found out that if this is a colonic wall, and if there is a vessel coming to the colonic wall like this, you won't find lymph nodes beyond 10 centimeters on either side of the tumor. Am I clear? So if you want to take out the pericholic lymph nodes, you need to take lymph nodes only up to a length of 10 centimeters on either side of the tumor. For a margin, 10 centimeters is more than enough. And for the lymph node clearance also, 10 centimeters of pericholic lymph nodes on both sides is enough. But depending upon the vascular architecture, this may differ, but about 10 to 15 centimeters of length of resection is enough for the sake of margins, mucosal margins, and this much of length is enough for taking the pericholic lymph nodes also. So Japanese have come down on the extent of colonic resection. So they don't take out huge length of colon. They take only 10 to 15 centimeters on either side. And they found out that beyond 10 centimeters, there is no involvement of lymph nodes on pericholic lymph nodes. So as I said earlier, if you look at this picture, for a European surgeon, for a Western surgeon, it would be a right hemicolectomy. They would go up to here, take out the entire right colon and part of the transverse colon also. But the Japanese philosophy is that it's not the length of the colon that matters, it is the radial extent of dissection of nodes that matter. For here, you can confine yourself to 10 centimeters on both sides, because beyond 10 centimeters, the pericholic lymph nodes are rarely involved. That's why I said central vascular ligation is slightly different from the Japanese D3. Japanese D3 is about going more radically as far as nodal clearance is concerned and being less radical in terms of the length of the bowel remote. Whereas the CME-CVL concept as proposed by the Western literature is going by the conventional right hemicolectomy, left hemicolectomy, and taking the vessels up to the root. But if you go a bit more onto the surface of the nodes and take out the D3 lymph nodes, it would be the same as the Japanese classification. So that is the basic difference between Japanese D3 and the concept of CME-CVL as propagated by the Western literature. The question is, does this improve the survival? Is there evidence to say that D3 is superior to what we all used to do conventionally? Again, when you do a D2 versus D3 study, you can find that definitely there is an increase in the number of lymph nodes retrieved. In a D2 dissection, average lymph nodes 15, but in a D3 dissection, you can go up to 22 or 25 lymph nodes. But does that improve the survival? We don't have data to that. This study showed a slight improvement in survival in terms of D3 versus D2, but this was a retrospective analysis. But which are the subset of patients which should go for a D3 dissection? Again, this was a study which looked at D status and T status, involvement of D3 nodes in terms of T status. For a T1, very rare. T2, no nodes. But when it comes to T3 or a T4 lesion, you can see that in 3 to 5% of patients, the D3 nodes are involved. So for early colonic cancer, which is T1 on T2, there is very rare chance that the D2 station or D3 station of lymph nodes are involved. But when it comes to T3 or T4 lesion, about 3 to 5% of patients will have positive nodes at this level. But again, this was a retrospective analysis. And again, this is only randomized controlled trial. If there are surgical oncology postgraduates or there are MCH graduates, please note this. This is the only randomized controlled trial, the COLD trial comparing D2 versus D3. They found out that 30-day mortality is comparable. Leak rates also were comparable. Leak rates were unfortunately higher in the D2 arm, but nodes retrieved also were comparable, but node positivity was very high in the D3 arm. So this study, the final results or the oncological outcomes have not been published. It's only the short-term outcomes which showed that by doing a D3 dissection, there is no increased mortality or morbidity. the node positivity or the nodal yield increases, we had to wait for the long-term outcome of this study to say that D3 is superior to D2 in an oncologically superior manner. Again, there are so many other trials, T-REX study, RELARC study, or the RICON study, all looking at D2. And so if you ask me what is the new thing or what is the happening thing as far as colonic cancer is concerned, I would say D3 is the happening thing. And more centers are doing D3 dissection. When I say D3 dissection, over and above the conventional surgery, you would take that extra number of lymph nodes over the surface of the superior mesenteric artery and superior mesenteric vein on the right side. But as far as the left side is concerned, I don't think there's much of a difference, because even otherwise we were doing a inferior mesenteric artery high ligation and clearance of those nodes. So on the right side, it is making a small difference, but does it impact the outcome? I don't have the answers, but we have to wait for these randomized control trials to come out with the publications. So if you ask me today, what should be the way forward? In a node positive patient, I would say the Japanese say D3 dissection should be done. Very early colonic cancers, D2 would suffice. But T3, T4 lesions, even if it's node negative, there's a chance that the D3 nodal stations are involved or positive. So you should be doing a D3 dissection for all node positive patients and T3, T4. That would be the way forward as far as D3 dissection is concerned, till we have evidence from the 3 studies that I previously mentioned. Now, the next thing I would like to touch upon is locally advanced colonic cancer. When I say locally advanced colonic cancer, I mean colonic cancer which are infiltrating any other adjacent organ. And as I said earlier, it is most part of colon is intraperitoneal, and among the various sites of colonic cancer, the sigmoid is the commonest site which gets adherent to any other adjacent organ. Because it's one of the most mobile parts of colon, it very easily gets adherent to small bowel, the pelvic structures, etc. And this particular picture, you can see that. But as far as surgeon is concerned, I don't think this makes a huge difference as far as surgical management is concerned. For example, look at this picture, you can see that the ascending colon and the hepatic flexure can infiltrate the ureters or a part of the kidney. The splenic flexure can infiltrate into the tail of pancreas or the spleen, and the left side it can get infiltrated into the kidney or the ureters, and the sigmoid colon can get infiltrated into the bladder. But the point is that most of these organs which get infiltrated by the colonic cancer are resectable organs. For example, the ureters can be resected. The spleen can be resected. The tail of pancreas can be resected. The kidney part of it can be resected. A bladder, most of the time it will be resected, because this picture very clearly shows that most of the time the sigmoid colon gets infiltrated in the dome of the bladder, and the ureteric orifice or the trigone of the bladder is most often preserved because of the peculiar anatomy, that because there's a peritoneal reflection over here, and this peritoneal reflection usually prevents the sigmoid getting infiltrated into the ureteric orifices. In females, the uterus serves as a good buffer in between the bladder and the sigmoid to prevent it from infiltrating in the trigone area. If it's infiltrating the trigone area, it's a different picture. But if it's infiltrating the dome of the bladder, you can do a partial cystectomy. So most of the organs which get infiltrated by the colon can be resected, and it says that commonest organs are the ovary, urinary bladder, bowel, uterus, and these are the organs that are commonly infiltrated. So all these organs can get infiltrated, but they are organs which can be removed or sacrificed by a multi-vessel resection. But the point is that in majority of the cases, in 30 to 35% of patients, it's only an adherence. Pathologically, they are not infiltrated. But you have to go ahead with doing a multi-vessel resection if at all they are involved, because if you do a multi-vessel resection, the survival is better than doing a no multi-vessel resection. So if there is an adjacent organ which is infiltrated, like the ureter, the kidney, the transverse colon infiltrating in the stomach, or the splenic flexure infiltrating the spleen, or the tail of the pancreas, or any other structure, should be resected. The only contentious issue would come in terms of duodenum or the head of the pancreas, where you would have to do colo-Whipple. So whether that should be done or not, we will discuss if there are questions later. But all other organs are easily resectable and reconstructed without much morbidity and mortality. Again, this again shows that multi-vessel resection should be done, but what matters is an R0 resection. If you're not able to attain R0 resection, you have good survival, but if you're not able to attain R0 resection, the effort is not worth it. So whenever you do a colonic surgery, and if you find that an organ is being infiltrated or abutting, if it's a dispensable organ, it has to be resected to attain R0 resection. That's the point I was trying to make. Now, again, coming to our next aspect is minimally invasive surgery in colonic cancer. I don't think I need to spend much time on that. We have long-term data coming from the COST trial, COLOR trial, and CLASSIC trial, and also from meta-analysis of 25 randomized controlled trials, which have again shown that in terms of short-term outcomes, as well as in terms of oncological outcome, at least laparoscopic surgery is as good as open surgery. But the point is whether we have evidence for robotic surgery. Again, majority of centers have moved out to robotic surgery, but again, short-term parameters are in favor of robotics over laparoscopy. Lymph node retrieval also shows that robotic surgery is as good as laparoscopic surgery. So probably we may be moving into more and more of robotic surgery over and above laparoscopic surgery. So I don't think there is any confusion or any need for discussion on that aspect. Now, the second aspect I would like to discuss over here is the role of adjuvant therapy in colonic cancer. As I said initially, in a stage 1 colonic cancer, if you do surgery alone, you have 5-year survival of about 85 to 95%. In a stage 2 cancer, with surgery alone, you have an outcome of 60 to 80%. It's 5-year survival, surgery alone. But in a stage 3 patient, you have survival of only 30 to 60%. So from this graph, it is very clear that in a stage 1 patient, a surgery alone would suffice. In a stage 3 patient, surgery is not enough. You have to do something more. In a stage 2 patient, the outcomes are equivocal. So you have to improve the outcomes. What are the ways for doing that? Again, I don't want to go into too much of trials. Again, this is one landmark trial which established FOLFOX as the choice of treatment. It was a mosaic trial which said that in stage 3 patients, the overall survival as well as the disease-free survival was statistically better than 5-FU leucovorin alone. Conventionally, 5-FU leucovorin was the treatment that was being used for colonic cancer, and this mosaic trial showed that FOLFOX is better for stage 3 patients in terms of overall survival and disease-free survival. But when it comes to stage 2 cancers, the evidence was not strong enough because the mosaic trial again showed that stage 2, there was no benefit or no statistically significant benefit in stage 2 colonic cancer. And again, this was the long-term data of mosaic trial, which again very clearly says that in stage 2, there is no much benefit, but in stage 3 cancers, there is a significant benefit if you give FOLFOX over 5-FU leucovorin. So this is what established FOLFOX as a standard treatment, but subsequent to this, various trials have tried to improve upon the outcomes by adding FOLFIRI, bevacizumab, cetuximab, etc. in the adjuvant setting. But none of the trials proved to be superior to FOLFOX. So based on the data of mosaic trial and the NSABP trial, today what I can say is that FOLFOX is standard of care. And again, as people who have been practicing oncology, you would know that FOLFOX can be replaced by CAPOX because FOLFOX and CAPOX have shown equivalent results. But the point is that FOLFOX has not been compared to CAPOX in a direct manner. Indirectly, FOLFOX and CAPOX have been compared. Evidence to say that CAPOX can replace FOLFOX. So today, if you ask me what is the consensus as far as stage 3, when I say stage 3, I mean node positive patients, the standard of care is 12 cycles of FOLFOX or CAPOX. But before I end the consensus over there, again, let me take you to a very recent publication. In stage 3 colonic cancer, the IDEA Collaborating Network tried to reduce the duration of chemotherapy because 12 months or 12 cycles of FOLFOX or CAPOX has got its own toxicity in terms of hand-foot syndrome, peripheral neuropathy, which can be very crippling. So people are trying to reduce the duration of chemotherapy. And this particular trial compared 3 months versus 6 months and showed that in a low-risk patient, stage 3 low risk, 3 months of Celox is what is enough. But if the patient is high risk stage 3, then you have to give all 6 months of FOLFOX. So today we have a situation where even among stage 3 patients who are node positive patients, 3 months of Celox would suffice. But if the patient is stage 3 and high risk, I quantified the risk over here. Low risk stage 3 means node positive, but T1, T2, T3, 3 months of Celox is good enough. In a high risk patient, you'll have to go for 6 months of FOLFOX or Xelox in node positive patients. That is the consensus regarding adjuvant therapy, stage 3. But when it comes to stage 2 colonic cancer, as I said earlier, there is no consensus. There have been so many trials, the intergroup trial, the QSAR trial, the IMPACT trial, the intergroup meta-analysis, the ASCO meta-analysis, all have tried to find out whether there is any benefit for stage 2 colonic cancers. But the picture has been dismal except for the QSAR trial, which showed that there is a significant improvement in 5-year survival. All the other studies were negative studies. And again, this was the data from the QSAR trial, which showed that there is improvement of 3.6%. So this is the only study which shows that in stage 2 patients, there is a benefit of giving chemotherapy. But the ASCO meta-analysis, which is the largest meta-analysis, about 4,000 patients, showed that there is no difference in outcome in stage 2 patients, whether you give chemotherapy or no chemotherapy. So today, if you ask me, the debate continues in stage 2 patients. The Mayo Clinic, the IMPACT trial, if you can show me 4 trials saying that there is no benefit, I do have 2 other trials saying that there is a benefit. So the debate has not ended as far as stage 2 colonic cancer is concerned. Today, how would you take it? As I said, stage 2 colonic cancer, the survival is bad. You want to improve this. but there is no data to support that all these patients should receive. But high-risk patients among stage 2 should receive adjuvant chemotherapy. What is high risk in stage 2? T4 lesions, bad surgery in terms of lymph node retrieval, poorly differentiated carcinomas, and perforation. So this is the ASCO guidelines, this is the ESMO guidelines, this is the NCCN guidelines. If you look at all these guidelines, there are 3 factors which are common. A T4 lesion, less lymph nodes retrieved, and poorly different carcinoma has to get adjuvant chemotherapy because it's a high risk stage 2. Perforation, obstruction are high risk factors in some guidelines which are not in some other guidelines. So you have to take a call on stage 2 patients. You have to categorize the patients into high risk and low risk and tell them that the outcome is going to be poor. The benefit of chemotherapy is also not very conclusively proven, but since you are a high risk patient, you would need chemotherapy. But currently we are moving on to what is known as a personalizing cancer therapy even in stage 2 patients. So if a patient is stage 3, they are high risk, they would receive chemotherapy. But if the patient is stage 2, you first classify them into microsatellite like stable and MSI. If it's MSI stable, you don't need to give chemotherapy because it's a low risk patient. But if a MS stable patient, then you have to categorize the patient based on the risk factors and decide whether you have to give chemotherapy or no chemotherapy. So this is the way we are moving forward in terms of colonic cancer. Not only the morphological factors, the genetic factors or the mutational factors also has to be taken into account while deciding on chemotherapy for colonic cancers. Now again, this is the summary of adjuvant chemotherapy. If it's a stage 1, no need for chemotherapy. Stage 2, low risk, no chemotherapy. Stage 2, high risk, yes, chemotherapy. Stage 3, yes, chemotherapy. What is the benefit? 5-FU gives a benefit of 3 to 5% in stage 2, 10 to 15% stage 3. Add on Xelox or Folfox, you get added 4%. So about 15% to 15 to 20% benefit by giving adjuvant chemotherapy in stage 2 and stage 3 patients. Now, why can't you consider new adjuvant treatment options in colonic cancer? Because I said there can be advanced lesions which are adherent to adjacent organs. Why can't you give new adjuvant therapy, downstage the tumor, and then operate? Again, this has not been conclusively proven in spite of our efforts to find out a new adjuvant therapy in colonic cancer. Because if you look at stomach, if you look at rectum, if you look at lung, if you look at esophagus, if you look at breast, every other organ we have moved on to what is known as new adjuvant therapy. But in terms of colon, we don't have evidence except for this one particular trial, Foxtrot trial. The initial data was published in 2012 that tried to give preoperative chemotherapy with locally advanced but operable colonic cancer. And they found out that there is significant downstaging, less of apical lymph node positivity, and less mortality and morbidity, or acceptable mortality and morbidity. But the points against was that 17% of the patients progressed while on chemotherapy. 20% of the patients had margin involvement after surgery. So the long-term data has been published, which shows that it is a negative study. Because if you look at 2-year recurrence rate, it is 14 versus 18%. So if you ask me today, the Foxtrot trial tried to find out whether there is a benefit of giving neoadjuvant chemotherapy in locally advanced operable colonic cancer, not in metastatic. But the final results published in ASCO 2019 abstract form says that it is a negative study. So if you ask me today, is there evidence for neoadjuvant chemotherapy? No, there is no role for neoadjuvant chemotherapy. If it's a locally advanced infiltrating adjacent organs, go ahead with surgery with multi-vessel resection, but your aim should be to attain R0 resection. Again, lastly, radiation colonic cancer. Again, this is one randomized control trial which tried radiation in T4 lesions and R1 resections, margin positive resections. This is the intergroup trial, phase 3 randomized trial. It was a negative study which showed that there is no role. But again, let me tell you, the role of radiotherapy is not a closed chapter, because recently in 2019, December, there was a publication from the SEER database looking at the role of radiation in T4 cancers. And they said that this was a retrospective analysis. There is a marginal benefit of radiation when compared to no radiation in T4 lesions. So even though the randomized control trial evidence is not in favor of radiation in colonic cancer post-operative, this one particular analysis published in 2019 tells me that the concept of radiation is not a closed chapter. It is still being actively considered. So in a patient who has got a T4 lesion, or in a patient who ends up margin positivity, there may be a role for adjuvant radiation in addition to adjuvant chemotherapy. How would you follow up a patient with colonic cancer? Again, colonoscopy is the standard modality, full colonoscopy. And if a full colonoscopy has been already done once in 3 years. But the most important thing is CEA, which is done every 3 months for 2 years. So first 2 years you would do for every 3 months. And for the next 3 years, after the first 2 years, till 5 years, you do every 6 months. And once 5 years is over, you presume that the patient has been cured and disease-free, and you would reduce the frequency to annually. So for the first 2 years, you do a more intense follow-up. And after 2 years, you would reduce the frequency and come down to annual CE examination after 5 years. So this is a standard follow-up. So one last point I will touch before I conclude is that, before I conclude is, what would you do if the patient has got a rising CA in the post-operative period? Again, you should understand that there are several factors affecting CA. Smoking can affect, your blood glucose level can affect, inflammation can affect, lab errors can occur. So when a patient comes back to your OPD with a rising CA, the first thing that we all practically do is repeat the value at short interval. The question is when to repeat. For example, you usually do the CA at 3 to 4 monthly interval. But if the patient comes to you with a rising CA, what we do is we call back the patient after 21 to 28 days and repeat the CA. That is because of the fact that the half-life of CA is 14 days. And if there's a doubling over that period of time, then it's a true rising CA. And then you have to evaluate the patient. Now, what would you do if the CA is really rising? You have to look for colonic recurrence. You have to repeat the scopy. You have to look for metastasis in terms of liver metastasis, lung metastasis, peritoneal metastasis. And based on what you are suspecting, you have to start off a battery of investigation in terms of ultrasound, chest X-ray, CCT, or a PET scan. How would you go about it? Again, it's a big question, which investigation first? Again, what the thumb rule that we follow in our OPD is that if it's a sharp rise, you are expecting multiple metastasis. So you can do an ultrasound and chest X-ray because these are two investigations which you get on the same day itself. So you can decide what the patient is going through on the same day itself. But if it is only a mild to moderate rise in CEA, you're looking at a picture of a patient who may have a small lesion in the lung or the liver. Your ultrasound or chest X-ray may not suffice. You have to go by what is known as the CCT or PET scan. So if the rise is very high, for example, a patient had a CE of 5 last month, and this month it is 25 or 30, then you're expecting multiple liver mets and multiple lung lesions. So you can start with ultrasound chest X-ray. But if it's only 5 has gone up to 11, then it's a small rise, but a significant rise. Then you have to go by what is known as CCT and PET scan. And most of the time we go by the PET CT to look for lesions outside the liver and outside the lung also. And how would you go about it? Again, I would like to just conclude by saying that you have to go for liver resection and lung resection. What matters is ability to attain R0 resection and the functional status of the lung and the liver post-operatively. Good oncological outcomes. Again, there are scoring systems known as the FOAM score to predict the outcome after metastatectomy. But one organ where you should aggressively pursue metastatectomy is colorectal cancer because the outcomes are superior in terms of multiple resections. You have non-resection methods like ablative methods. I'm not going into the concept of metastatin because that's not part of this particular talk today. So what is the future like? As I said earlier, we are moving on to, we know that right-sided colonic cancers are different from left-sided colonic cancer because not only at the presentation level, anatomical level, or the symptoms of the patient, at the molecular level also, the right-sided colonic cancers are entirely different from left-sided colonic cancer because the mutations seen on the right side are different from the mutations seen on the left side. So based on this, we are probably moving to what is known as the molecular subtypes of colonic cancer, where it is classified based on the molecular differences or the genetic differences into consensus molecular subtype 1, type 2, type 3, and type 4. Or probably we are moving towards what we have seen in breast cancer based on the genetic mutations, like your classical, your basal type, luminal type, luminal A, luminal B. We are moving to something like that in colonic cancer also. This may not be of much importance for a surgeon, but in choosing your adjuvant therapy or a metastatic setting, this classification may become important in another 2 or 3 years. This is what we are coming to. So that's what I wanted to speak about in terms of colonic cancer. I think I've touched upon the surgical principles, the principle of lymph node dissection, the principle of extent of colonic resection. I've spoken about something about adjuvant therapy in stage 3. There is no much of confusion. Stage 2, there has been some confusion. And I tried to clarify some of the things regarding the surgery, radiation, chemotherapy, etc. in terms of colonic cancer, the concept of neoadjuvant therapy. So thank you very much for a patient listening. And if you have any doubts, I'd be happy to answer the questions.
Extraordinary lecture, Madhu Murali, as always. I was telling my wife, who's a surgical, oncopathic breast surgeon, that Madhu has got a way of teaching, and you know, he understands things differently,
Thank you,
from what we do.
Sir.
Wonderful, very, very. Actually, a lot of new things I've learned.
Thank you, sir.
Prathapan? Prathapan, are you there?
Yeah, Prathapan is there, but I think some problem with his audio, I think.
Okay. For anyone to comment or to question?
Yeah, excellent presentation. But it is, we are used to Dr. Madhu Murali because he belongs to our state. No? He's our, so I used to watch his lectures over YouTube, which you already uploaded. I think
Okay.
maximum viewers for Madhu Murali's talk. Now, I have a few clarification, Madhu. Now,
Sure,
if you
sure.
have seen a patient for the first time with a high CEA, and your initial evaluation, you did not pick up any site of metastasis, is there an indication for doing direct PET? Only by looking at the CEA value, will you offer a PET, or will you be doing surgery saying that it may be due to volume of the lesion rather than metastasis?
Prathavan, that's a nice question, because that particular aspect even has been looked in terms of a metastatic setting, not in a primary setting. In a patient who have done a PET CT scan, do you really, and there is no metastasis, do you really need to go and do a PET scan to pick up mets which are not picked? I understand that all these patients would have a baseline CT of the chest and abdomen. You're not picked up something, CE is raised. Should you do a PET scan? Again, let me tell you, the opinions are divided. A lesion which is not picked up by a CT scan, will it get picked up by a PET scan? That is the question. My concept is you can take a call based on your practice. There is no evidence or there is no recommendation to do that. But there are centers, if you can see this particular slide, you can see that addition of a PET scan over a CT scan may pick up lesions which are not picked up in about 2.7% of patients. So there are chances that lesions which are not picked up on the conventional CT scan get picked up on an add-on PET CT in 2 to 3% of patients. But whether it should be done in all patients, I don't have an answer to that. But one fact is very clear: a patient who has got a very high CEA and doesn't have metastasis on CT scan is a poor prognostic factor. But what you should be looking at is whether that patient's CEA will come down to normalcy after surgery. If that patient's CEA will come down to normalcy after surgery, his outcome is going to be good. That's what I showed in one of my initial slides, that if the CEA comes down to normal, then it is good. But if the CA doesn't come down to normal, it is bad. Whatever you do, the outcomes are going to be poor. That's what I showed in this particular slide. So if the CA, after the surgery, the CA comes down to normalcy, it is good. But if CA doesn't come down, it's bad. So that's a poor prognostic factor. Whether addition of PET scan, I'm not sure, 2 to 3%, yes, your point is taken.
Yeah.
Rakesh?
Regarding the use of polyvisceral resection.
Yeah, Dr. Madhur, congratulations for excellent talk. I
Thank
just
you.
want to know the role of metastatectomy in colonic cancers.
So since you asked that question, I'll go into that, because I purposefully avoided, because that's a different topic or different session as well, because, for example, metastatectomy can be done in 2 situations. One is a synchronous situation. For example, a patient comes to you with colonic cancer and you do a metastatic workup and you find that the patient has got a liver lesion. That is synchronous. That's one. The second aspect is you have treated the patient and send him for follow-up, and after 1 year, 2 year or 3 year comes back with a rising CA, you do a CT scan or a PET scan and pick up something that is metaconus. So these are 2 different entities. But the point I want to convey is that if there is a lesion which can be resectable by R0 resection, when I say R0 resection, I don't take into fact the numbers, I don't take into fact the size of the lesion. The only thing that you have to take into fact is the volume of the residual liver. So if you can attain R0 resection, which is functionally good liver, or if you can attain a good R0 resection in terms of lung resections and have a good PFT post-operatively, you have to go ahead and do a resection wherever possible. That is one peculiarity of colonic cancer. There are very few malignancies where aggressive metastatectomy has got a very good outcomes. One is colorectal cancer, second is sarcomas. So these are the 2 areas where you should aggressively pursue finding out metastasis and doing R0 resections. And if you're not able to resect, you have so many options: downstaging, potlane embolization, converting them into operability. So the point is, colorectal cancer is one area where you should aggressively follow up the patient. Why do you want to follow up the patient? To pick up metastasis. Why do you want to pick up metastasis? Because you can treat them. How? By doing R0 resection. So that is the concept of metastatectomy in colon and rectal cancer. The same principle applies for sarcomas. But the same principle doesn't apply for a pancreatic tumor or for an esophageal tumor or for a breast cancer, because metastatin is not the standard rule in those organs. Colorectal cancer and sarcoma, for the sake of postgraduates and students who listen to me, should be aggressively followed up, and all metastases should be picked up at the earliest stage and operated. Am I clear, sir?
Thank you very
Again,
much.
Dr. Rakesh, we have a lecture tomorrow on colorectal metastasis from Dr. Shruti Reddy from the UK at
That's
8 p.m.
great.
same time.
So that would answer most of the questions, I think.
Yeah, Dr. Pradhaban, you're saying something. I interrupted. I'm so sorry.
I know Prathapan is going to talk about colorectal, I think.
No,
And he was asking something, then I.
Yeah, please,
no,
Prathapan, sir. Go ahead.
Yeah, Madhu, when you have a lesion in the hepatic flexure area, there is a high chance that that may infiltrate directly the duodenum, or maybe a larger lymph nodes at the root of middle colic vessel, which may be infiltrating pancreas. Suppose you detect those lesions where there is a high likelihood of ripples in the operation, because we have done ripples with colonic resection in the reverse direction, because I have done 3 ripples resection
Colonic
for
resection.
synchronous colonic cancer in that patient. The situation is we are planned Whipple but did colonic resection. But here we have planned colonic resection but planning to do Whipple. Is there a real role for neoadjuvant in that situation? Because role of neoadjuvant is controversial, but I still believe that there is a role in decreasing the node size, because node may respond and you can very well avoid a major pancreatic resection.
I think as Prathapan rightly said, it is not the colonic primary that infiltrates the pancreatic head or the duodenal wall. It is the bulky nodes at the root of the mesentery that infiltrates the pancreatic head and the duodenal wall. So if you ask me, is there a role for Colo-Whipple? There are a lot of publications of Colo-Whipple in colonic cancers, but I don't have any experience of having done a Colo-Whipple for a colonic cancer. But we do have experience of having given neoadjuvant chemotherapy downstage and ended up doing just a colonic resection in bulky nodes. For example, if you have a few minutes, this is a patient's video, which the date is clear, 2 weeks back. 2 weeks back, we had this patient. If you look at the duodenum is coming, I hope we can see duodenum. Duodenum is coming. See, this is, sorry, I'll stop here. So if you look at this image, see at this point, this is the colon and this is the duodenum. So very well, you can see that it's almost infiltrating or suspicious infiltration. So this patient was a 40-year-old male. You can see the date at the lower part is 26/6, almost 10 days back. So I went ahead in this patient, I didn't give neoadjuvant chemotherapy, we went ahead in this patient with the presumption that we may have to do a colonic surgery with the resection of the lateral wall of the duodenectomy or a wedge resection of the lateral wall of the duodenum. But fortunately, this patient had dense adhesions over there. We were able to dissect out with clear margins, and he ended up with doing just a right hemi. Just for the sake of postgraduate, so this can be the situations. The colonic lesions can very well infiltrate the second part of duodenum. But again, as you said, Colo-Whipple is described, but you can give neoadjuvant. That's what we do. We give neoadjuvant downstage and take off a surgery.
And one last question. That is, if you have a patient with familial cancer, not the FAP, the Lynch type of tumor, you are operating a young patient with a left-sided colonic cancer, and you have shown different types of surgeries like right hemicolectomy, left hemicolectomy. What is your preference? Because I had to do 3-4 surgeries in one patient in last 15 years because he had multiple side tumors over the course of that 15 years. So my take is, if you have a left-sided lesion in a familial cancer, if you are doing the first surgery, I think you can do maximum surgery rather than just stick on to the area of involvement. This is just as a prophylaxis, but you just still preserve his sigmoid or the proximal part of rectum. I think that may be a controversial issue, but still I believe I have done 8 to 9 patients like that, but none of them developed after that surgery, because I had to do multiple surgeries. But when I did subtotal colectomy with ileorectal anastomosis, none of them had a tumor in the rectum. Because what I feel is the Lynch syndrome, the tumors are mostly right-sided tumors. As you mentioned, the MSI is mostly on the right side.
Yeah, to a large extent, I would agree with your point of doing the maximal surgery, especially in patients who are less than 50 years of age. what I would like the your postgraduates to understand is that whenever you're taking a history in a patient who is less than 50 years old, if you take a history in a very casual manner, you may miss out. But if you sit with the patient for 10 or 15 minutes and take a careful history of any malignancies, any of his blood relatives, most of the time there will be history of a colonic ovarian cancer or a thyroid cancer or a breast cancer or some other malignancy in any of these blood relations, either on the father's side or mother's side. That's one way. Second is still if it's less than 50 years, you have to do a microsatellite instability study in the specimen. The biopsy specimen, you can study that, and if it's positive, you can upfront go with total colectomy, because I also hate going back into an operated abdomen. Same thing, there are several patients who had done a colectomy in terms of right or left, and we were forced to go back 3 or 4 years later when the patient develops a synchronous lesion in terms of family history. So if there is a strong suspicion of family history as per the Amsterdam criteria or the Bethesda guidelines, or based on the family history, if you take it more precisely, I agree that in young patients, it would better go for a total colectomy, not in every other patient, but in when cases where you have high suspicion of this being familial cancer. Familial cancer is a different ballgame, polyposis, etc. Again, that I have not touched upon. I have just confined myself to straightforward colonic cancers, because familial cancers and management of cancers with polyposis is a different topic. We'll have to go deep into the genetics, deep into the different surgicals, reconstructive options, etc. That's why I didn't go into that.
So can I have the question?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah. Radeshwar, yes.
That's excellent presentation, sir, as usual.
Thank you.
Is there the role of adjuvant therapy in colonic cancer in there is no contiguous organ involvement?
You mean
Role
to
of
say
neoadjuvant therapy, sorry.
Again, sir, let me tell you, the concept of neoadjuvant chemotherapy has evolved in many other organs.
Yes.
During the same time, people have tried out various methods to include the concept of neoadjuvant therapy into colonic cancer also.
Yes.
But somehow, when the results have been favorable in breast cancer, lung cancer, esophageal cancer, even in pancreatic cancer, but in terms of colonic cancer, till now we don't have any data to say that there is a role for neoadjuvant chemotherapy or neoadjuvant radiation for that matter in colonic cancer, because it is a surgically amenable organ. Even if it's infiltrating an adjacent organ, as I said, most of the adjacent organs, except for the pancreatic head or the colon, can be resected without much morbidity. Even if you give neoadjuvant chemotherapy, the surgery is not going to change. You have to resect the organ which was involved. It doesn't, separate out from the previously infiltrated organ. So the concept of downstaging for the sake of reducing the extent of surgery has not taken much role in colonic cancer. And moreover that, the survival benefit of neoadjuvant over adjuvant has not been proven in colonic cancer. So today, if you ask me, is there a role for neoadjuvant chemotherapy or neoadjuvant radiotherapy? I would say no. Surgery forms the primary modality. Whatever the nature of the disease, if it is infiltrating the abdominal wall, take out the part of the abdominal wall. If it's involved in the splenic hilum or the spleen, the pancreatic tail, resect it. If it's involving the bladder, go for a multi-vessel resection. That would be my take on that.
Okay, sir. Thank you for clarification.
So any other questions from the audience? Garima, you have a question?
Yes, sir. So, good evening, sir.
Yeah.
Sir, when a patient presents with peritoneal metastasis on presentation for colonic cancers, sometimes we have come across patients with obstructions also in similar cases. What should be done, sir? Peritoneal multiple metastasis in colonic malignancies.
Are you bringing the concept of peritonectomy and HIPEC into the discussion?
No, sir. I'm asking, like one of the patients we had with a obstruction with peritoneal metastasis, and we went for a colostomy.
Okay.
Colostomy also, sir. In the site of the stoma where we created, there were multiple metastases, and later on the site of stoma itself, metastasis was involved. So, what should be done in such cases, sir?
You're taking up a case of one particular very peculiar situation. Let me tell you the general concept about peritoneal disease in any malignancy. If there is extensive peritoneal disease, maybe stomach cancer presenting with obstruction, or colonic cancer, or a small bowel cancer, or for that matter rectal cancer presenting with obstruction, if there is extensive peritoneal disease, ascites, my point is don't touch the patient, because the survival of this particular patient is not going to be more than 3 months. Don't prolong his misery. But if there's a limited peritoneal disease, then I would go in and even resect if the performance status of the patient is good And I think that the patient is going to do good in the post-operative period. So if the survival is going to be 6 months or 12 months or something like that, I would do a palliative resection and a stoma, something like a Hartmann's procedure. But if you think that the patient is not going to live more than 3 months based upon his general condition, other parameters, the extent of the disease, a stoma would suffice. But as in the case you said, even a stoma was disastrous in that patient. So that is a patient you should not be touching up. If you open up and see that entire bowel is studded with multiple nodules, small bowel, large bowel, you don't have enough space to create a stoma, just close it and come out.
Okay, sir. Okay, sir. Thank you so much.
Any other questions?
There are questions in the chat box, so if somebody wants me to answer a lot of questions in chat box, please answer. Somebody is messaging me. Should I take it, sir? Because, okay.
Yeah.
So thank you, sir. Okay. Sir, is there any cutoff for CA level which indicates metastasis? Again, I would say if you are talking to me in scientific terms on evidence-based problem, there is no cutoff, because but generally it is said that more than 100, the chance of patients having metastasis is much high. So you have to go for extensive metastatic evaluation. For example, as I said, is there a role for routine CT chest in all patients? I said, you need not if it's early colonic cancer. But if it's early colonic cancer and the CA is more than 100, then that would become an indication for a CT chest, even if the patient doesn't have an advanced lesion. So that's about CA. So upper rectum is above peritoneal reflection. So is there a role for neoadjuvant chemoradiotherapy in T3, T4 upper rectum? Again, let me tell you that point I had very clearly clarified when I spoke about rectal cancer. Is rectum is not about the peritoneal reflection. It is the length 15 centimeters from the anal verge on a colonoscopy. So if your lesion is 15 centimeters from anal verge, it has to be taken as rectal cancer. Upper rectum, maybe just above the peritoneal. If any part of the lesion is coming within 15 centimeter or from the anal verge, you have to take it as rectal cancer and give neoadjuvant chemoradiotherapy and then operate. I'll repeat, if any part of the tumor is within 15 centimeters from the anal verge, it is treated as rectal cancer. If no part of the tumor is within 15 centimeter, it is treated as sigmoid and take it for surgery followed by adjuvant chemotherapy. If it is the other way around, within 15 centimeter, treat it as rectum, neoadjuvant chemo, radiotherapy, and then surgery. That is the way you go about in that borderline area. Then the next question is, sir, MSI testing and adjuvant treatment stage 2. As I said earlier, in stage 2, you can classify the patient as high risk and low risk based upon the lymph nodal yield, obstruction, perforation, T4 status, LVI, PN, etc. But we are changing over to checking the MSI testing. If MSI is stable, it is high risk. If MSI is other way around, it is low risk patient. So risk stratification can be based on MSI testing in stage 2 patients. Then again, our intermediate saying, sir, could we do primary anastomosis after resection, same setting, or should we wait till adjuvant chemo course gets over? Is there any risk? I don't understand the question anywhere. I don't think there is any problem doing a primary anastomosis unless you have a patient who has been obstructed and there's a disparity between the size of the bowel and you cannot do a side-to-side anastomosis. In that situation also, my point is that you can do a side-to-end anastomosis and divert it. Because if you do an end stoma, for example, Hartmann surgery, I hate a Hartmann surgery because reversal of Hartmann surgery is very difficult. You have to do a laparotomy, take down the stoma and find out the stump and anastomosis. So even if there is an obstruction and there is a huge disparity between the size of the two lumens, what I tend to do is I do a side-to-end anastomosis, and if I'm not happy with the nature of the anastomosis, I'll oversee it and do a diversion, because closure of a diversion is much easier than closure of a Hartmann's procedure. So that is the way I look at it in anastomosis. Does lymphatics and so if there is a patient has got a CA sigmoid infiltrated dome of the bladder, what extent? That's a nice question. If you look at this particular picture, which is again, can you see this picture? If you can see this picture, what happens is that sigmoid is most often redundant. It infiltrates only the dome of the bladder. Most of the time, because of the location of the ureteric orifices or the trigone, it doesn't infiltrate that area. So most of the time, if it's a sigmoid cancer, you would be able to get away with a partial cystectomy. But if you have any suspicion of involvement of the sigmoid to the bladder, what we do is we do a cystoscopy, make sure that there is no intraluminal lesion. If there's an intraluminal lesion, we take a biopsy and make sure that it's positive. And along with that procedure, all these patients, we put a stent pre-operatively. So if there is a suspicion of involvement of the bladder, or if there is a frank involvement of the bladder, we do a cystoscopy and stent the ureters. This will help you intraoperatively in doing a partial cystectomy and then completing the closure of the bladder. But if the trigone area is involved, then you will have to go for a radical cystectomy along with your colonic resection. So the point is that sigmoid cancers most often doesn't involve the trigone area. It involves only the dome of the bladder. And in those situations, you will be able to get away with a partial cystectomy. That's what, that's so many questions, sir. I lost track of the questions, sir. So, Naresh, sir, what should I do?
No problem. Because there'll be some on the Facebook group which you can answer leisurely.
Yeah,
Thank you so much. I think you've taken too much of an effort and time.
It's a precious, sir.
Thank you. Thanks. We'll see you again.
Thank you, sir. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone. Thank you.